Okay, so when we have managed our approach, we want to do the actual landing. So that this transition from the approach actually, well, to taxiing, to being firmly on the ground with all wheels. And this procedure, this transition actually is called the flare or the round out. The round out because we're gradually rounding out our approach path. At first, this is quite difficult to do because, of course, you have to judge correctly. You don't want to start your flare too high. You don't want to start it too low, and so on. So it takes some time to master this. One important thing that I know from my experience that helps a lot of people is to explicitly tell them where to look. Some students I had, nobody told them actually where they should look during the flare. And then it often happens that they look very closely ahead of the aircraft, so just over the nose, very close to the airplane. And this makes it much harder to judge the altitude above ground. It's much easier to look in the distance, so maybe towards the end of the runway. And then, of course, with your peripheral vision, you will also see the wings and that distance to the ground. You will also have some reference there. But with your forward vision, it's important to focus on a point that's far down the runway, not too close over the nose. Then roughly at 10 or 20 feet between that, you start your flare. The power is reduced to idle normally. And then there is a gradual increase in back pressure on the yoke or stick. Now what happens is you're coming in from your approach angle, then you pull the nose up a little bit as you approach the runway and start your flare. This will decrease the sink rate. The speed will decrease as well. Then when the speed is decreasing, you have less lift, the airplane will start to descend again. Then you pull a little bit more on your stick, again reducing the sink rate, you will get slower, airplane will start to descend, and you continue this, and thereby really slowly approach the runway, and ideally just before, shortly before the stall, when the stall warning comes, you touch down with the main wheels first. So it's important, main wheels first in a conventional tricycle gear airplane, and then you slowly drop the nose wheel. So don't just, when the main wheels have touched, don't just let go of the controls and the nose wheel will be rammed into the ground, but keep that back pressure a little bit, just gradually relaxing it so that the nose wheel can softly be lowered to the ground. This is maybe easy to talk about, but hard to do. So this is a matter of practice. During your training, you will fly countless traffic patterns and landing approaches, and at some point you will just get the feel for it. Now, when to start the rollout and flare depends on quite a few factors. So, for example, your descent rate when starting the flare, your pitch attitude, and so on. Also a matter of experience. At some point, you will be able to notice, oh, my descent rate is really high right now, and start your flare earlier. On other occasions, you may notice, oh, my descent rate is really low, I've been dragging it in pretty flat, so then you just probably start your flare a bit later. As I've said, one key point here really is not to look too close. Look into the distance, to the end of the runway or maybe even beyond. And if you have difficulty judging the height in the flare, remember this and really tell yourself, look into the distance. It really helps often. Also, as I've said, keep in mind that you will need some distance to flare. So choose your aiming point in such a way that your touchdown point will be behind it. So if you want to do a spot landing to a specific point, you will need to choose an aiming point that's actually ahead of the point you want to touch down at. Because if you're aiming directly to your touchdown point, you will never be able to touch down there except in the completely wrong attitude. Of course, you can touch down there with nose wheel first or maybe with all three wheels at the same time, but that's not the proper landing attitude. And this will probably lead to bouncing. We'll talk about that in a minute. So here's again schematic drawing of the touchdown. It's important that you touch down with the main wheels first in a conventional airplane, but I'm not talking about tailwheel airplanes now. At minimum speed, and to keep the elevator up so as to not drop the nose wheel. Also, don't forget that you also have your rudder pedals. So especially with crosswinds, but we'll come to that a bit later on in the next lessons, in one of the next lessons. Also keep the nose oriented on the runway center line, and after touchdown, keep the nose straight to avoid any side loads that are bad for the landing gear. Now let's talk about some common errors on landing, especially on the flare. Now, very common errors, of course, especially if you're a beginner, are a flare that's too early or too late. For example, if you flare too early, this could result in a float. So that means you flare too early and you're floating, but you're still quite a few feet above the runway. Of course, the danger here is that at some point you will get really slow and the airplane will drop, and a very hard landing could result. So just to remedy this, just adjust your attitude. If required, add a little power, but just be sure that in the end, when you actually touch down, the nose is up. If the floating is too long, especially on a short runway, simply go around and try again. To avoid floating, the key actually is that your speed is correct. For example, the Cessna 152, and that's a pretty common approach speed, actually has a speed of 60 knots in the handbook with calm wind. So if you want to fly your flare properly, and you also want to have your landing distance that you have calculated from the handbook, then you actually have to fly those 60 knots. I often see pilots who simply fly 70 knots just because they think it's easier. Of course, they bring more energy into the flare. Yes, they do, and they have more time to some kind of fine-tuned landing. At least that's what they think. But this often leads to an excessive flare and a floating down the runway. And you will get away with it if you're always landing on a 2,000-meter runway, yes. But then maybe someday you want to go to a 600-meter runway. And if you have always done it 10 knots too fast, then you will not be able to land there safely. So I make it good practice for myself that I always approach with my 60 knots, even on a very long runway, if traffic and all other conditions permit, of course. But we'll talk about that at the short field landing, in a short field landing lesson. What happens a lot as well is ballooning. So not just floating, but maybe coming in a bit too fast and then pulling back too much, so the airplane actually starts to climb again. Happens a lot, and whether you can save that landing depends on a few factors. If you really start a significant climb, it's best to use this climb right away, go around and try again. If it's only climbing a little bit and the runway is long enough, of course you can then adjust your attitude, start your descent again, maybe add a bit of power if required, and then make sure that you touch on the main wheels first. Another common error is bouncing. This is normally caused by the wrong landing attitude, which in turn is often caused by a speed that's too high. So bouncing means the airplane touches down and then jumps into the air again, maybe 2 or 3 times even. I've seen accidents caused by bouncing, and in 2 situations, the reason was that the runway was pretty short. The pilot came in pretty fast, and he wanted to force the airplane onto the runway. So he really flew it into the runway without much flare. So the touchdown was on all 3 wheels at the same time. And then the airplane bounced back into the air. And then porpoising can result, which is dangerous for the nose wheel. We'll see that on the next image, actually. So if the airplane jumps into the air, in many cases, you then have an excess airspeed because you have been approaching too fast in the first place. Then you can just adjust now your attitude, get the nose up, and do a normal touchdown. If the runway length is not sufficient for that, the answer is, as usual, go around. because bouncing can lead to porpoising. And that actually happened at the accidents that happened to pilots in my club. The airplane was bouncing. It was a short runway. It was the pilot tried to put it on the ground. So the airplane was bouncing once, and then during that bounce, the pilot did not establish the correct nose-up attitude, but he let the nose drop, so the airplane touched down with the nose wheel first. And this normally works. The nose wheel can take it once. Most of the times it can take it twice, but then on the third time the nose wheel hits the ground first, it normally collapses. And then you have a collapsed nose wheel, propeller damage, and so on, even engine damage normally. So if this happens, if you're coming in nose wheel first, the airplane bounces back in the air. Mind your attitude. Keep the nose up, and land on your main wheels. If the runway is too short, you guessed it, go around. As I've said, if there's a crosswind, we'll discuss that in our separate crosswind landing sessions, but also if there's no wind, do not only concentrate on elevator during flare and aileron, but also on the rudder. So you want to land without any side loads on the landing gear. What can happen if you reduce the power during the flare? That the nose of the airplane tends to yaw. It tends to yaw a bit to the right, for example. Then you need just a little bit of left rudder to align the nose of the airplane with the runway center line so that you can touch down without any side load on the landing gear. Because if you have high side loads, in extreme cases, this could also lead to a ground loop. A ground loop is actually more common in tailwheel airplanes, but it can also happen in nosewheel airplanes. It's just an uncontrolled turn on the ground, normally a 180 turn or roughly that in a very small distance. This is all in nosewheel airplanes is almost the result of wheel barrowing. When there is too much weight on the nose wheel, the braking action is not very good because the brakes are on the main wheels. And the airplane then tends to pivot around the nose wheel and then at some point turns around the nose wheel. This is often the result of a 3-point landing. All right, so this concludes the briefing about normal landings. I'd say let's try it. I'll see you in the airplane.